So, sorry. So Britt Outley has been my intern this year. So he has, um, like, languages are his thing. And so if you want to know anything about an ancient language or an ancient culture, this is pretty much your go-to guy here. So he went to Baylor, and yes, and he's just finishing up at DTS at Dallas Theological Seminary. Britt grew up here in this church. His mom is a deacon here, and his dad is an elder here. So he's been around here for a long time, and we love Britt. I, have gotten to know Britt over this last year and have just loved him more and more. And so you're in for a real treat. He's a very smart guy, and he knows very hopeful things. Yep. So this is Britt.
All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. This is going to be a clock that I have right here just to help me keep mindful of how long we're going. As Delynn was saying, we'd been talking about this since January because the original plan was for me to talk, I believe, in April. Which was train wrecked by COVID, as most things in this country were, and had to be put on pause and reconsidered. But I am excited to talk about this. So if we want to pull, okay. So for anybody who's at home, I don't know how many people are streaming, but it should show up on their screen as well. Not all the slides are going to show up for them, but it does say, if you have any questions, I'm going to do Q&A at the end. So it has my email up there. And I have my phone on me, I'll be able to get them. So if you want to ask a question, you can. But if you want to ask a question digitally and anonymously, I'll be able to answer that. But I'll also be able to answer anybody who's at home their questions about something I have. It's going to show up a couple times just so that you have it. But just so that you're aware. And if there's something that comes up and you're like, what are you talking about? Or I'd love to know more about that. Please let me know. And I love being able to do Q&A part where we're interacting. I much prefer that to actually just talking to you. But just let me know if you have anything you want me to talk about or expand on or anything. So I called this Magic Mojo and Moana because while Crossroads is non-denominational, it definitely has Baptist roots, and I love alliteration. That is very much in my DNA. That's very normal of like a Baptist preacher. But I want to talk about, in movies, there's lots of other religious influences. There's magic, people have mojo, and Moana is just straight up polytheism, which is what we'll talk about. There's many different gods. And I want to talk about specifically these other religions because people have the opportunity, I think, to engage these movies and draw their attention to the values and beliefs that you hold. But some people are kind of scared of there's other gods being mentioned. There's kind of magical powers being mentioned. There's sort of the almost, at this point, legendary kind of status of Harry Potter as being something you need to ban. And I don't like that approach, and I don't agree with that approach. But I respect that approach if that's what you embrace as a parent. But I'm kind of making a case for the other side of things, of expose and watch and engage and ask questions. And it, I think, sets up kids for a lifetime of knowing what they really believe, but being able to understand and engage with everyone else. So we're going to talk about some other religions. So this is what we're talking about today is, I just realized we are still figuring out how to transition. But just kind of going over what we're talking about today, we're going to talk about common influences from other religions and cultures in kids' movies. And this is going to be just a little bit academic. I'm just kind of won't go spend a ton of time on this, but just want to point out there's probably a lot more religious influences in Disney movies that you maybe think. I'm going to point to what I think are 3 helpful steps for engaging spiritual messages in kids movies. And I'm going to give several examples from some of my favorite kids movies. So I've got a couple clips, and we're going to watch them, and I'm going to talk about how I think about them theologically and how I'd want to engage a child with it, just as an example. I'm definitely not an expert. I'm actually not even a parent, but I have done a lot with kids ministry, and I was a really imaginative kid, so I'm just speaking as a amateur, what I think could be helpful. So first, talking about common religious or cultural influences in some kids' movies. First thing we're going to go to is monotheism. So monotheism is just a technical word for you believe in one God. It's from mono, meaning one, and theo, meaning God. Christianity is monotheistic. We believe in one God with three persons. So we believe in what's called the Trinity. But at its base, we believe in one God. So that would put us in the category of monotheistic religions. Judaism and Islam are also monotheistic religions. There are others out there, but these are the three major ones. And these are going to probably influence media more than most. So I have some info about Aladdin. It's like, Aladdin is actually written from the perspective of monotheism, from the perspective of Islam. And there's actually a moment in the movie where the Sultan goes, "Praise Allah." And there's a lady who's a deacon here who always tells a story of one of her kids when she was little, when she watched Aladdin. For weeks after, when something fun would happen, she'd say, "Praise Allah." And they were like, how do we feel about this? But it's definitely from the perspective of Islam. It's actually based on a work of Arabic literature that in Arabic is called 1001 Nights. It's also called Arabian Nights. So the story of Aladdin with the genie, this comes from authentic Arabic literature, but Disney takes liberties because they always take liberties. But particularly this concept of wish-granting genies actually originates with the Islamic concept of jinn. So jinn are kind of like, they're a race of supernatural spiritual beings, but they're different than both angels and demons. So in Islam, like in Christianity, God created the world, he created angels, some of them rebelled, and then he created people. But in Islam, he also created a group of beings called jinn. And the Quran talks about them as being like made of fire and living in sort of almost like spiritual or non-physical places, but they're not angels or demons. Like humans, they can sin, they need to be forgiven, and they need to be shown the way of salvation. It's pretty interesting. But the concept of this powerful spiritual being then being trapped inside a thing, and because you let it out, it'll grant you wishes and do supernatural things for you, that is based in this Islamic idea of jinn. And different imams would have all kinds of different opinions about them, but it's like Aladdin is Islamic, and that's not something to be worried about, that's just something to be aware of. Hunchback of Notre Dame is also a movie from the perspective of monotheism, particularly Catholicism. It's actually taking place in a Catholic cathedral. Notre Dame is just French for Our Lady. If you've been around Catholics talking about Our Lady of Guadalupe or Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow, these are references to the Virgin Mary. And there's actually several lines in the movie that are Frollo the villain, his main villain song is actually addressed to the Virgin Mary, kind of. He goes from being this pious prayer to this, like, I hate Esmeralda, and the hate in his heart is kind of revealed. But in the movie, you have Catholics like Frollo, who are monotheistic, and they're actually oppressing and killing the gypsies. Gypsy is a word that is used for Romani people, and some people think it's fine, and some people think it's offensive, just pointing that out. But Romani people actually originated closer to India and migrated to Europe. And as they migrated, they brought some Hindu practices with them, but they primarily became either Christian or Muslim, depending on if they settled in North Africa or Europe. But because they were very eclectic, and because they were very different looking, and they didn't practice Catholicism the way they probably should have, they were typically oppressed as an ethnic and religious minority. And that's where you get the concept of gypsies. And that's what Esmeralda and the other characters in this are, sort of a almost fantastical version of the Romani, who, because they were barred from getting certain kinds of jobs, tended to be street performers and fortune tellers and different things like that. So that's monotheism. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. It's from poly, meaning many, and gods, theo, meaning God. Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. There's many gods in Hinduism. There's Shiva and Hanuman and Shakti and Kali. There's I believe, like, the the belief is that there are 33 million gods, but I don't know if they've actually articulated the 33 million. It's just that's contained in the scripture that there's 33 million. Mormonism is potentially a polytheistic religion, depending on how you interpret certain things that the different prophets have said. So some Mormons will affirm they believe in the Trinity, but then they will say that God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit are distinct divine beings that do not have the same essence, but they are united in purpose. So does that make God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit 3 different gods? There's also a discussion in Mormonism about what happens after you die and potentially becoming like God the Father yourself and being able to create your own place. And so it's like in just thinking about it in terms of monotheism or polytheism, Mormonism probably fits a little bit more comfortably in polytheism, but not every Mormon would agree with that. It's kind of, there's variation within a lot of these different religious perspectives. I'm giving a totally generalization of just general ideas and things you'll see showing up and stuff. More often you're going to see polytheism in the many, many gods of different countries. So I said India here, but there's, Egypt, Anubis and Osiris and Isis and Ra. If you've ever seen The Prince of Egypt, there's a song where the magicians actually list, most of the song is just Sobek, Akdet, Wedjet, like all these just different gods and goddesses. Greece and Rome are famous for having lots of different gods, as is Scandinavia with Thor and Odin, which is actually where we get our days of the week. So Tuesday was originally was the name of the god of war. Wednesday was originally Woden's Day, which is a different way of saying Odin. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Frigga's Day. Frigga was the goddess of beauty. But we stuck with the Roman Saturn Day, the day belonging to Saturn, the god of time. And then we just went with Sunday and Moon Day, which became Monday. But our days of the week are named after gods. That's why in Spanish and in a lot of other countries, Sunday is not actually referred to as Sunday. It's the Lord's Day, because that's the Christian claiming of the day Sunday. And then Saturday is often called Shabbat or Sabbath or Sabbatic something, based on the Jewish Sabbath. But it's like even the days of our week are influenced by the various religions that have been around us. Hercules is an example of polytheism. It's full of gods and supernatural beings, drawn from many different Greek sources and also kind of Roman sources. Hercules is actually the Roman way of saying it. If you were going to say it like a Greek, it'd be Heracles. Like Dylan was saying, my main specialty is like ancient Greece and Rome and Latin and Greek. So that's my favorite thing, and the Bible. The plot of Hercules revolves around a god whose divinity is actually stolen, and he has to prove his heroicism in order to become a god again. Moana, which is a personal favorite of mine, is also from the perspective of polytheism. There draws on the religions of Polynesia, and the plot revolves around a human who's going to help the gods by returning a sacred artifact, and then is assisted by the demigod Maui, who's shown there with the giant fishhook. The giant Samoan man is Maui. There's also a perspective called animism. This is a worldview that sees basically all of nature as having souls or some other sort of animating sentience to it. It's from anima, soul. Lots of religions are animistic, like Japanese Shintoism. But many cultures all around the world, in Africa, in Asia, and even to a degree some of the New Age spiritualism that will go on in America could be described as animistic, seeing kind of life in everything. And then there's also often looking to the ancestors, worshiping them or seeking their help. That would be a part of animism, seeing the spirits of dead humans still as active in the world. So Pocahontas is from the perspective of animism. There's a living tree that she talks to. There's the wind in the leaves that's sort of guiding her around. But there's also a song in it where she basically directly confesses, I believe in animism. She says, "You think you own whatever land you land on. The earth is just a dead thing you can claim, but I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name." That's just straight up animism. When she's touching them in the movie, you actually see them glow with the life that's pervading all of nature. animistic thought. In Mulan, you see her not really going to the spirits of nature, but specifically worshiping the ancestors, honoring them, trying to serve them, and keep up the family name. And so she prays a number of times to the ancestors. And then Mushu, the little dragon that's up there, comes to life and is a supernatural spirit that helps her. Brother Bear has both of these pretty prominently. It's about a man who doesn't respect nature and then is turned into a bear to learn that, all of life is sacred. So you have him learning all these animistic lessons about nature, but specifically there's a song in it. It's like the swelling, Circle of Life in Lion King is like the really powerful song. The really powerful, musically beautiful song in Brother Bear is a straight up prayer to the ancestors. Great spirits of all who lived before us, take our hands and lead us. Fill our hearts and souls with all you know. Show us that in your eyes we're all the same, brothers to each other, in this world we remain. Like, that is great spirits, teach us, guide us, you are our gods, basically. That's animism. That is very much a pervasive force in the world and shows up in Disney movies. Just a couple other religions that you could see. I actually only mentioned one, but it doesn't really cleanly fit into any of the categories I've shown so far, would be Buddhism. So Buddhism is very complicated and has over 500 million different adherents. There's two main branches, Theravada and Mahayana. Theravada is like what you see like the Buddhist monks that are up on like mountains and being all mystical and stuff in movies. That's usually them trying to draw on Theravada Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, where you see Buddhas everywhere, and that's something that is prominent even in America, where people are like, I'm Buddhist, I have a little Buddha, I seek him for help, and I'm trying to be enlightened. That's the more popular version is Mahayana. But it also looks like whatever culture you're in. So like Japanese Shintoism is very heavily affected by Buddhism and colors it quite a bit. A unifying theme is basically overcoming suffering by detaching oneself from yourself and from the world. And there's a huge emphasis on balance and self-discipline and trying to achieve enlightenment. So it's like, these are just some examples of different movies. So the Kung Fu Panda trilogy is written from a Buddhist perspective and incorporates Taoism and Confucianism and a lot of other Chinese religious ideas. But it's basically about how Po, this panda, the Kung Fu Panda, learns some basic lessons of Buddhism, and that helps him be a better fighter so that he can beat the bad guy at the end, while they're all a bunch of funny talking animals. One of the main things that he's learning is about sort of balance in the world and finding inner peace, and kind of detaching oneself from past suffering or trauma, things like that. And it's like, this is out there. These are in movies. These are just some examples. There were a number of different categories. Like, it's like I could bring up this one or this one or this one. Princess and the Frog is theoretically monotheistic because theoretically it's Catholic, but also very affected by voodoo, which is kind of animistic and polytheistic. And there's also a character in it who like literally summons demons to come do magical things. So it's all over the place with religious influences, but it doesn't really fit into a neat category. So it's like, how do you actually engage this? Because a lot of people's response to this is to say, I'm not going to let my kids watch that. But it's out there. They're going to see it. It's going to be talked about at school. There's going to be books that they're going to read. They're going to have similar perspectives. It's not necessarily a fun animated Disney movie, but they're going to have to read it and hear about it at some point. So one perspective is say, protect the kid from it as long as possible. Another one would say, train them early how to engage it and think about it. And I have basically 3 steps that I think would be helpful in engaging it. This is part of kind of how I thought when I was a kid, kind of the way my parents talked. But also, this is a little bit formed by my reading of Scripture and my reading of early church fathers. So because my emphasis is on Greek and Latin language and Roman Empire, my seminary degree has been predominantly focused on early church Christians. So after the apostles, what were they doing? What were they talking about? What were they writing and reading? And how were they interacting with all of this polytheism and pagan gods and Greek philosophy? And so this is also partially adapted from their approach. But basically, I think the 3 steps that are helpful are, first, creating a household vocabulary for talking about God. So you need to have a way in your home that you talk about what you believe about God. I've been talking from a Christian perspective. I'm going to keep going. I don't know that everyone in this room comes from a Christian perspective, but that's kind of what I'm going to assume at this point. But if that's not exactly, just tweak what I'm saying. But for me, talking about the Christian God, there's just certain important things that I would emphasize, and we'll talk about those. Then I would say creating a household vocabulary for talking about virtues. You don't even necessarily have to call them virtues. You could call them good things, or having character, or however you want to talk about it, and you think your kids can understand. You need to have a set way of talking about them. So I'll expand on that. And then the last is that there's a few basic questions I think you could ask pretty much any movie, and it'll be helpful drawing them to your vocabulary for God and your vocabulary for virtues. So let's talk about those. So creating a household vocabulary for talking about God. You want to develop a way of discussing spiritual beliefs that your family holds. But you need to realize that kids are extremely concrete. So when you say things like, I want to ask Jesus into my heart, they're thinking about a man named Jesus somehow getting in their heart. So you don't want to use metaphors like that as much. You want to be careful about, what is the metaphor we're really emphasizing? So, or maybe just don't use metaphors. You want to receive Jesus' forgiveness. That's not a metaphor, that's just true. And over time, they'll learn more about what forgiveness means. But rather than accept him in your heart, just accept him, accept what he says, believe what he says is true, things like that. But this has to make sense in your family. So it's like your way of talking to your kids. You are the expert on how they understand the world and how they talk and what they're like. And so this has to be very much catered through the lens of what your kids are like. But the more they're going to hear from their parents, the more they're going to bring what they've been hearing from you to the movies that they see. So when they see a movie about Buddhism, they're not necessarily going to think like, yes, I want to become a Buddhist. Unless you've literally never answered any questions that movie may be answering, and that's their first exposure to an idea. So if Buddhism shows, like in the movie, when this guy dies, he fades away into flowers, and then he's around in the spirit world doing kung fu and stuff. If that's their first exposure to what happens after you die, that might color what they think about when they die. But if you've already talked about what you think about what happens when you die, then when they see that, they're more probably going to interpret that through the lens of what you already told them. They're going to naturally assimilate it to what you've said because that's become their norm. I just think that as much as you can talk about your way of thinking about the world, other stuff's going to be added. It kind of makes me think about the whole adage of, if you say one negative thing, it takes 7 or 17, or people quote different numbers to kind of override it. But it's like if you're emphasizing in your home something over and over and over and over again, one little spiritual message from this movie or from that movie is not going to override the majority of the messages they're hearing. So some examples of Christian truths that I think would be worth emphasizing. This is partially based off of the kids' curriculum that we use here at Crossroads, and partially based off of what I think is just important theology. So the first one would be God made us and loves us. Because what you're essentially saying is God is the creator, he made everything, and he is loving. He is all good. He is seeking the best for you. Like in Romans, it says that all things work together for the good of those who love him. God is ordering the universe in a way that brings benefit to you. But a kid, that's harder for them to understand. But God made us and he loves us. That's really easy to hold on to. God made us and loves us. It's really short to say. It could be something that you tie in, when you pray before a meal. God, thank you that you made us and you love us. Thank you that you've given us food that we can enjoy and we can be here together as a family. Amen. That's a great prayer to say as a family. And it has imparted some of what you believe to the kids. A second thing, and I don't know that this is on the little handout that I sent out. So these 4 in particular, if you wanted to write down, because I just really like these ones. Because this is basic theology really boiled down. Sorry? The questions I sent you, is that sent to everybody? Those discussion questions? Sorry. But I don't know that these four are on there. So the second thing would be God is everywhere, knows everything, and can do anything. This is just basic theology proper, is what it's called at seminary. But basically that God is all the omnis. He's omnipresent, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's omnibenevolent. Basically, God can't be stopped. He's everywhere. I don't totally understand how that works, but he's everywhere. If you just say that, they'll just kind of start to understand that he's everywhere, that he knows everything. He knows more than I do. He knows more than mom and dad does. He can do anything. He's all powerful. You can't stop him. If there's any scary thing that happened in a movie, well, God could beat that. You emphasize the greatness and the power and the unstoppability of God. Another thing would be that Jesus wants to be our friend. This is, I think, the most basic expression of the gospel, because the idea that God wants relationship, you need to understand that before you understand, like, and sin separated us from that relationship, and so Jesus came and died because he loves you and wants to restore that relationship. But the gospel, in my opinion, starts with the garden, not the snake. But I think the more often that kids hear this, Jesus wants to be my friend, that is their most basic understanding of the gospel. And then they find out, but sin gets in the way of that. But guess what? Jesus handled it because he wants to be our friend. And the last thing that I really emphasize, this was a big deal for me when I was a kid, was that Jesus is the king of everything good. So if there's a really powerful witch in a movie, or a really cool person with superpowers, or Superman, or scary robots in space, whatever, if something is good, Jesus is the king of it. And everything else is either on Jesus' team or against Jesus. But because Jesus is everywhere, he knows everything, he can do anything. He's all powerful. No one can stop Jesus. He's the king, and he's in charge, and he's going to win. So it's like the more this is just how you talk about God, the more when they go to media, the more when they hear about other ways of thinking, the more they're going to bring how you've talked about God to it. So similarly, you want to talk about virtue. And again, you don't have to use the word virtue, but essentially you need to develop a way of discussing in your family, the same way we're talking about with a vocabulary for God. We want a vocabulary for virtues. So when your spouse does something honest, or your kids show bravery or whatever, you need to show that you value that. If you value honesty, you need to praise your child for when they're honest. And when a character in a story is honest, you need to make a comment on it. Some examples of Christian virtues, again, also partially adapted from the kids' curriculum we use here, would be honesty, telling the truth, responsibility, doing what I've been asked to do, courage, doing something even when I'm afraid to do it, kindness, being generous and loving towards other people, even if they don't deserve it. Wisdom is being able to make the right decision, and respectfulness is respecting people because of who they are and maybe the job they hold, not necessarily how they act. So like even when mom makes a mistake, you still need to respect mom, that kind of thing. These are really good values. You could add to this list, you could subtract from this list, but you need to have a set way of talking about it. Because then when you see it in a movie, you can say, that kid was honest. Or maybe you prefer bravery rather than courage. Well, that was a way to show bravery. They were being brave right there. And then the last question, or the last step here is to ask these three questions. So basically, kind of in light of our vocabulary about God, you can ask, what does this say about God? So like in Moana, there is a goddess whose heart is stolen, and then she needs to get her heart back in order for her to sort of basically come back to life. Well, is that true about our God? No. And that's all you need to really say about it. You don't need to belabor the point. You can just say, that's not true. Our God doesn't change. He's all powerful. No one could steal his heart. And then keep going. Next question would be, what does it say about people? You know, in this movie, people got really sick and they needed help. Sometimes we need help. And it's just like good to reinforce, like, what is the commonality between us and this character, even though they're in fantastical situations? Where do you see a connect? And then what virtue here can we imitate? So were they brave? Were they kind? Were they honest? Did they take responsibility? Were they wise? And drawing attention to that. Because then they're thinking about Moana as someone who's brave, not necessarily as someone who is interacting with a bunch of gods. So some things about talking about God I just wanted to run through real quick is basically you want to focus on truth and you want to minimize your focus on error. Basically, it's more important that they know that God is the most powerful God than it is knowing that Zeus doesn't exist. And this kind of follows the pattern of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, so I also said a cute little phrase, connect more than you correct. So try to connect things to the God of the Bible. So like Zeus was really strong. Our God is really strong. And just leave it at that. It's more important that you make God the star than it is to, again, try to negate that Zeus exists. So in the pattern of the Bible, God revealed himself not as the only God first. First, he revealed himself as the most powerful God and the most forgiving God. Then he revealed himself to David as the most loving God and the most beautiful God, the one who comes near in a way that everybody else doesn't. And it's not until Isaiah, hundreds of years after Moses and hundreds of years after David, that God starts saying things in the Old Testament like, I'm actually the only God that exists. So God was more concerned with establishing what he was like than he was concerned with denying what the other gods are like. Now, the other gods were saying things like, I'm the strongest. So God was like, no, I'm the strongest. But he didn't say, and also, by the way, Ra doesn't exist. He just beat Ra. That's in the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues are basically God showing how all the most important gods of Egypt are not as strong as he is. He's not necessarily negating their existence as much as saying, like, I'm the God that's in charge of the universe. So I would focus on what the movie gets right about God and what God is like, rather than trying to say, like, witches aren't real. You would emphasize that Jesus is more powerful than witches. But then if they ask, like, wait, but are witches real? You can be like, well, no. And it's like, you can answer questions, but I wouldn't initiate saying, a witch isn't real. I would initiate with that witch that the kid who's 4, I don't know, can't tell the difference between Daniel Tiger and Moana and Pooh Bear, emphasizing that Jesus is in charge of everybody who's good, and he can beat anyone that isn't, rather than trying to establish what's real, what isn't. This is where it comes back to, like, do you tell your kids about Santa? I think it's totally fine to tell your kids about Santa if they know that Santa shows up to celebrate Jesus' birthday. And then when they find out that Santa isn't real later, whatever, because the focus is always on Jesus' birthday, and even Santa shows up to celebrate Jesus' birthday. So I would just say always affirm that God is the most powerful, he's the most wise, he's the most forgiving, he's the star of the show. I would always set the example of Jesus as the ideal. He's the king of everything good. I'm going to skip through just a little bit because I'm going a little slow. When you're talking about people, again, I would focus on truth and minimize the focus on error. So when, they're in a spaceship, you're not necessarily always in a spaceship, but in that spaceship, they got in a fight with someone. And I got in a fight with my brother. So making the connections to the human elements, because every movie, whether it's talking animals or it's a robot or a god or whatever, they're characters in a story, and characters in a story act like people. Otherwise, we wouldn't enjoy the story. So focus on where in the story they're acting like people and how we can learn from that, how kids could learn from that. Just taking an example. Emphasize that God made us and loves us, that he wants to protect us, and then maybe sometimes we struggle, but that's okay. And then when you're looking for virtues to imitate, you need to use your household vocabulary that you've developed. So you can use cinematic moments to kind of play on them. So I gave the example of Anna in Frozen. She sacrifices herself. Self-sacrifice is kind of like being brave and kind at the same time. In The Lion King, Simba demonstrates humility because I think I would define humility as believing what God says about you and acting accordingly. But he finally owns up to who he is when he identifies as the true king. He's being both honest with himself and taking responsibility. But if you already have this way of talking about being honest and taking responsibility, you can then talk about all kinds of other virtues as basically being honest, being kind, being wise, being brave. And then they can see themselves in the character. Oh, Anna was courageous and kind. I can be courageous and kind. And they can learn about the virtues. And so I would just say, I think that these movies with all these supernatural elements and different spiritual messages, what you're primarily going to gain from them is pointing kids to virtue. But they're also opportunities to talk about what God is like, either by contrast or, hey, God is like that. So I gush about Moana. Moana is one of my favorite movies of Disney. Not one of my favorite movies ever. But the ocean in it is so much like the God of the Bible. And I'm actually going to show a clip of why, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I love Moana. And then when you can, I would emphasize that Jesus is like the supremacy of all these virtues. So like when you see a character being brave, whenever you can, just also being like, and Jesus was brave. He's actually the most brave. And when we want to be brave, we want to be like Moana, but we also want to be like Jesus. Wasn't Jesus brave when he gave up his life for us? And it's like, I don't know how often you want to talk about the gospel, that how you expose kids to that is at different ages is for you to decide. But drawing attention to how Jesus is the example of all of the virtues in the way that he gave his life, resurrected to give us new life, and is now the king. Like he is the perfect example of all our virtues. Some other random thoughts that I just had is that basically, it's good for you. It's good for your kids to know that you aren't perfect at virtues when you make mistakes. I know you probably hear this in other places, but I just think it's important that like kids know you aren't perfect and you're working on it, and they're not perfect and they can work on it. It's also good for them to know that you don't know anything or don't know everything. Sorry, that you don't know everything. It's actually very powerful to tell a kid, "Hey, I don't know. Let's learn about that together," or "Let me go look that up for you," or whatever. That modeling the fact that it's okay to not know all the answers and still believe things is really important for kids. And then the last thing I was just going to say is that like you can't use every moment. It's not like every single movie your kid ever watches. You need to be like, okay, how could I, direct this? This is just sort of like in your life. Your kid's going to watch, I don't know, Frozen 10,000 times. So maybe a couple of those times you ask them about the virtues that you see, what this maybe says about God, what does this say about people, and use some of the moments that are going to appear to you. But most of the many teachable moments, opportunities to do this, you're going to miss them, and that's okay. You're not perfect, and that's awesome. But I did want to say, you are a much better spiritual teacher than you probably think you are. What you have to say to your kids is very valuable. And when you talk about the movie they just watched with them, they're just like, they might even just be like, "Mom, I don't want to talk to you," whatever, I don't know. Kids can be angsty at any age, but what you say really does affect them over time, over years, and it's valuable. So that's everything I have so far, other than I have a couple clips that I wanted to watch and then talk a little bit about. But I want to stop here and just let y'all know if you have any questions, we can definitely talk about those. But I wanted to play 2 clips first from Moana that I'm obsessed with. So just to set the scene, Moana is a lady. Oh, could you pause it real quick? Yeah. Just click one of the other slides. Awesome. So in Moana, she's a little girl on an island in Polynesia. We don't know where. The island is called Manjanui. And in the clip, she's gonna have an opportunity. She's gonna have to make a moral choice, and she's like a little kid. So it's like any kid can like see themselves in Moana making this choice. But because of that choice, the ocean is like, "Oh, I can have a relationship with you," and then is generous, and it's fun to watch. But then you see this little gem, and that's called the Heart of Te Fiti, just let you know. So let's watch Moana be adorable and courageous.
Shoo! Shoo!
So in that, we saw Moana make a choice to deny, oh, there's that pretty shell she wants, and it's drifting away. She's going to lose it. But she's going to go and help the little turtle. And that's just a perfect example of, like, sometimes we need to not get what we want to help somebody else, or to do what we need to do, or take responsibility. There's a couple different ways you could spin that to the virtues you want to value and bring about. It's kind of going out. I love then, because the ocean saw that she was a compassionate person, wanted to have a relationship with Moana. So led her out into the water, kind of showed itself to her, kind of played with her, was gentle, fixed, did a little flower in her hair, and then gave her a job that she doesn't know is a huge job until a little bit later. But the ocean gives her that little jewel. It's called the Heart of Te Fiti. Te Fiti is this goddess that you learned about at the very beginning of the movie, who is essentially the source of life and stuff. And like plants grow because she's alive, but her heart got stolen. So now she can't really do that. So everything in the world is very slowly dying. And something needs to be done about it. But all Moana knows at this point is that she loves the ocean, and she wants to be in the ocean. Her dad keeps saying, don't go out there. But I just love drawing on the fact that the ocean right there, and then for the whole movie, demonstrates total control. Absolutely, can pull back the water, can play with her and be gentle, so when she touches it, it's just a little trickle. It's not the whole weight of the ocean. But then when she needs to get back, he could just take her, give her what she needs, supply protection around her even when she doesn't realize it. I just feel like there's so many analogies, particularly in Moana, between the ocean and God that would be really easy to play with. You then get through the story. I don't want to spoil it, but I'm going to spoil it. We're going to watch the last clip in the whole movie, or very, very close to the end, where she actually has grown up. She's learned who she was. She's learned her family's heritage of traveling on boats and being explorers. And it has become clear that the ocean was actually trusting her with that jewel, with the mission to actually restore that to Te Fiti so Te Fiti can come back to life. The whole time, Te Fiti, where she needs to get the heart, the jewel, is guarded by this giant goddess demon of fire and lava, shooting lava everywhere, and is just dangerous, and they've been trying to get around her and protect themselves from her. And Maui's there. He's the big Samoan man who is fighting. And so you're going to see Moana make, in my opinion, a wise choice, a brave choice, and a compassionate choice. So can we do that next one?
Te Fiti.
So, in that clip, we saw Moana realize that. Could you switch it back to the thingy? Awesome. We saw Moana realize Te Fiti is Te Kā. That took wisdom to make that realization. That the thing that has been trying to stop her this whole time is actually the thing that needed the heart. Second, she was brave by, the whole time the ocean is actually protecting her from Te Kā. And the ocean waited for her to ask, hey, actually let her come to me before the ocean opened the way. But she was actually brave in being willing to face this crazy firestorm demon thing. And then she was compassionate and kind to say, like, I'm actually going to restore to this destructive evil thing the thing it's missing, and then it can be restored and redeemed. And I just feel like there's a million lessons you could learn about that. But basically, if you want to just focus on, Moana was courageous. She went up against the dangerous thing because she knew what she needed to do. But there's also a whole thing about how, if Te Fiti represents the life of a people and how they're torn apart by sin, not knowing who they really are, but when you restore to them the message that God actually created them for a purpose, to be virtuous, to be loving, that becomes life-giving to a whole group of people. That's kind of the basis of missions. But I just feel like there's a lot that you could learn from that, but I feel like that's just an example of some of the things that I could highlight. We've definitely gone over what I was thinking I was going to go. I'm sorry. But do we need to stop? Okay, so let's do some questions for a couple minutes, and then, I'm sorry, I went long. I'm living up to Charlie's. I'm Charlie's junior. But do we have any questions? Am I making sense? Did you feel like this is something that you could do with a movie? Because I don't feel like it should be that hard to just say, this is our basic way of talking about God, this is our basic way of talking about virtues, and then when I see that in a movie, here's a connection you can make. But any questions? I noticed I didn't get any email questions, which is fine. Yes, ma'am? Mm-hmm. Right. To be completely honest, I don't know. I feel like that's going to come with a family. Y'all are probably better at judging that for your kids than I am. But how you talk about a movie, you obviously want to simplify, which is why I think that those 4 statements that I gave, I feel like any kid who can talk can understand what you're saying when you say that. And they may have questions, but it's like God made us and loves us. He's everywhere, knows everything, and can do anything. He wants to be our friend, and he's the king of everything good. But as far as like watching a movie like Moana, I feel like I know lots of friends who have like really little kids, and they just turn it on, and it's just amazing and pretty. But even a kid, I feel like a kid the size of Moana could understand what happened to Moana when she was making the choice about the turtle. But as far as like scary fire monsters and stuff, it's like, I don't know if that's age appropriate. But it's kind of like, what are you already showing them? And think of this way about what you're already showing them. So I'm not necessarily saying, although I am, at some point you should show your kids Moana. I'm more saying whatever they're already watching, there's opportunities for this kind of thing. So if they're watching, what's that show with the kids that turn into the kind of superpowered animals? PJ Masks. It's like the superpower is in that. It could be an opportunity to talk about God's power. So even though I'm pretty sure as a kid's show it has its own lessons, there are other lessons that you can find. But then when you just decide to turn on Frozen for the 1000th time because they're asking, pay attention to the way that Elsa is powerful and draw connections to the way that God is powerful. So she has this ice magic. She's able to make an ice castle. Well, God did that with the whole world. God made everything. God made us and loves us. So tying it back to this way of talking about God and this way of talking about virtues, there's always an opportunity for that. But as far as, I don't know, age appropriateness. I'm sorry, that wasn't a very helpful answer. Yes, ma'am? No. I think that makes perfect sense. So that is a perfect negative, not in the sense of bad, but as a opposite example. So it's like when there's positive examples, you should draw a connection to that. When there's negative examples, bridge the gap. So it's like they weren't honest, but we can be honest. So it's a positive affirmation to them and an encouragement to them. But yeah, I think that's a perfect example. So I don't know if everyone heard. She asked the question of, so in a movie, what if you point out that they were dishonest and then there were negative effects in the movie? It's like, yes, that's great. But having a good way of talking about honesty already, so that when you identify, hey, they weren't honest, your kid knows what that means. Because if you just start talking about self-sacrifice, like, what does that word mean to them? But if you give examples in everyday life of them being courageous and of being compassionate, and then when they're courageous in a compassionate way because they're giving of themselves, you can then introduce them to the concept of self-sacrifice. So it's like building this vocabulary, I think, is really good. But I think that that's a great way to engage movies is, hey, they didn't practice their virtue. And do you see how that didn't work out well for them? I think that that's good. Any other questions? If not, I think we're good. No. I had a couple in case, but I definitely went long, so we don't need to keep going. I've got some Lion King. I think Lion King is great. There's lots of different movies that are going to talk about like knowing who you are, which I think is really good as early as possible to connect with knowing what God says about you, because who you are is what God says about you. So in the movie, specifically Simba sees, like, he knows he's the king, but he knows he's the king because his dad told him. And then the dad appears in the sky as a ghost and reminds him, no, you know who you are. You know who I told you are. And then he finally takes responsibility and identifies as the true king once his dad reminded him. And that's a perfect parallel to, like, who God says we are is who we are. And we need to remember who he says we are, because that's what's true. And then act like it. But, yeah, I guess that was the only other thing. All right, thank you guys. Thank you for letting me go way over.